Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Now, unless you have been totally avoiding the news for a while now, I'm sure you're aware that there's been a lot of news coverage of Ebola virus. And so, in keeping up with what's happening, I've decided to do a couple or three broadcasts on Ebola. We're trying to keep them down to a half hour. I know attention span isn't too great, and if we get too long, people get tired and turn it off. If we're not exciting and jumping up and down and making funny noises and faces and all that, I guess the attention span is pretty short. So we're working on keeping them at a half hour, but occasionally it gets away from me, and there's always so much to say and tell you that it can be a big issue to get it all in. So at any rate, we're going to call this broadcast Ebola Virus, Facts and Insights. And when I say some insights, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things related to viruses in general, and of course many in particular to the virus at hand. Now, it's interesting, of course, it is a strange virus, and the symptomatology progression is not a pretty sight in many cases, and so it is getting a lot of attention, and of course proposed epidemics are always scary, and everybody's afraid they're going to become the victim of some warring virus. I say warring because we're always hearing about the fight against cancer, the fight against this, the battle with such and such, and gee, I don't really kind of see it that way. I think it's various manifestations of the functionality of the world. And at any rate, I've been following the Ebola issues from way back, and when I say way back, from the very beginning. And if we were to add up all the deaths so far, including the current one, it would fall far short of 1 year of the flu season in the United States, in which the CDC has said in time past, unless they were either puffing as a term means exaggerating, and or if they're really telling the truth, they have said that on the average in the flu season, and I have this in some material that I printed out directly from the CDC, it says that on the average in every flu season in the United States, approximately 36,000 people die of the flu or the flu shots. Now, as of yet, I've been unable to ascertain how many of those deaths actually are the flu shots. But in any case, they're saying 36,000. Now, that's 36,000 each year versus, I'm just guessing that in sum total, it's approximately maybe between 2,000 and 3,000 cases of fatalities of Ebola since 1976, when the first outbreak occurred. Now that, if you put that in perspective, that means that in a period from 76 until 2014, which roughly is pushing 40 years, 30-some years, there's been less than 3,000, so that would be 1,000 per decade, roughly, or so, or maybe a little less. And here we're talking about 36,000 a year. So I think I'd be more scared of the flu at this point and the flu shots than I would the actual Ebola. Not to say that it's not important. However, we will give you some information about Ebola in particular and about viruses in general, because to get an understanding as to why could the flu be fatal, well, there is reasons why when you have an epidemic that some people succumb and many people don't. And it's quite interesting. It's not that simple, like 1, 2, 3, but pretty close as to why you might become a casualty of a virus as opposed to, or a fatality, as opposed to someone who becomes the caretaker of all those who have succumbed. To start out with, if you want to get into more depth, the Center for Disease Control has put out a neat little packet. It's called the Ebola Hemorrhagic Fever Information Packet. And on the front, as you can see, it has a photomicrograph of one of these strands of Ebola virus. Now, it's generally referred to as a filovirus because it looks like a filament. If you were to compare like a fiber of cotton or a fiber of wool or whatever under a regular microscope, it would look something like this, like a fiber. The difference, of course, is that this fiber is filled up with RNA sequences, and it's the RNA sequences that ultimately become problematic in the body. Now, as you know, we have friendly DNA and RNA in our body, but viral particles come in and they can be RNA or DNA, but foreign to us, and hence, in a sense, they become a poison or a toxin to us. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about viruses in general because I think you really need to understand the whole thing about viruses. Kind of takes the mystery out of it. So you start out by, first of all, I think it's not a bad idea to read a book that's going to at least give you some insight into early days of the Ebola. Now, you know that the first 2 outbreaks were in 1976, and in one case there was Zaire and Sudan, or Sudan, depending on how you want to pronounce it, in North Africa, and those were the first outbreaks. Now, down the road in this discussion, before we're finished, we want to make some observations that I think are provocative, and I think you might find it interesting to consider and maybe see what you can find for yourself. Now, everything that I say, I want you to check out. If it's my opinion, I'll tell you it's my opinion. If I have documents in hand that say otherwise, or that back up what I have, then I say, this is what was said by the CDC or the government in general or the Health and Rehabilitative Services or World Health Organization or whatever. I would say most of what I say is backed by those type of sources. I have my own interpretation sometimes because, remember, the same set of facts can be organized in different ways and give different outcomes. So when I'm talking about, in my opinion, then that's what I mean, that I have looked at all the data that I can gather, and out of that, this is what seems to be a likely conclusion. So at any rate, there was a good book came out about 19 years, I think, after that, called The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. Now, I checked on Amazon. It's still available. It's probably on my website, too, mentioned. But at any rate, this investigative reporter spent a lot of time looking into Ebola, first of all, because it had popped out in 1976, and then there were small little incidents, and there was another a little stronger that occurred again in 1995, which is about the time he came out with the book. So anyhow, it's been around since, at least known, let's put it that way, since 1976. And that first year, between the two, there was approximately 600 deaths. But the percentage rate was high, and that's what made it so scary, is that a lot of people were concerned that, uh-oh, boy, if you get it, there's about a 90 to 95% chance that you're going to be wiped out. Well, that isn't quite true. Now, it is true that there are some more significant percentages than others, but there are cases where people have gotten it and have recovered. There's been some that were left impaired, either of vision or brain function, because of bleed out in the brain or in the vision, the eyes. But otherwise, people have recovered from it, and there's never been a plague or any kind of a illness that I know of that there were, number one, were people not susceptible, number two, that there were survivors, and that number three, over time, it actually became less instead of more. It always seemed to reach a peak and then kind of fall into the background. And there's a lot of reasons for that, many of which we don't even have time to get into, but I have spent probably, I would say, 50 years plus studying heavily into health, viruses, bacterial forms, fungal forms, parasites, and so forth. And I think I have a relatively good take on it. I've worked with people with all kinds of problems, including I had, in my career, one case of acute rabies, which was treated successfully and the person survived. Apart from that, I've not had a case of Ebola, but I've anticipated that it's likely to occur, and so I have kind of, I would say I'm prepared, and we won't be talking about it today in the broadcast. It's going to take down the road. We will be talking in a further broadcast about some considerations that you might want to look into in terms of being prepared for these type of things. It wouldn't have to be Ebola, because there's a lot of other stuff out there. In fact, when we talk again about hemorrhagic fevers, from the CDC again, you see that little blue with the white CDC in it up at the top of the page. I go to the horse's mouth, I assume it's the mouth, as much as possible to get good information. And so they have a section called viral hemorrhagic fevers, and I looked at the listing of the various ones that they're talking about, and it looked to me that there's approximately 18 major hemorrhagic fever viruses from around the world. And we're going to talk about one in a minute in this country, that it kind of missed you, I'm sure. It got some press, but it didn't last long. It came and went pretty fast, but it did happen, and so we'll talk about that a little bit. And so I've got to remember not to forget that. Okay, so I would get the Hot Zone and read it. It's an interesting read. This investigative reporter who has a scientific side to him and has done a lot of scientific reporting. He wrote this book and kind of left some things up in the air that I thought were interesting. And you'll probably enjoy the book because he's good at telling the story, and he has a flair for the drama. So you'll find it intriguing. Okay, so let's talk about viruses a little bit. And viruses are interesting in the sense that I consider them to be a non-living entity by any way you try to measure. They basically work by energetics, meaning attraction, either magnetically or chemically, and they don't have conscious direction. Now, I contrast that to bacterial forms, which are one-celled living organisms that take in nutrients, give off byproducts, and they reproduce. Now, a virus has no digestive machinery. It has no energy production machinery. It has no reproduction capability. It is a piece of information. Now, when I read these books about, well, it has learned how, or it can do this, or it attacks and blah, 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 it doesn't do any of that as far as I can see. Viruses are pieces of information, toxic, of course, because otherwise there would be no issue with them, and they're cellular toxins. And basically, the two types are RNA viruses and DNA viruses. Okay, so the DNA viruses are genetic material. RNA viruses are transcription material, although there's a lot more learned about RNA today, but it's beyond what we want to talk about right now. So, first of all, as I say, I don't see them as living. And they don't attack you. It's like you poured some flower petals on a stream that was moving along, and somewhere along the way, one of those petals happened to stick against something and remain there. Would you say that the petal attacked whatever it stuck to, or that it just stuck to it randomly? Well, in a sense, that's, to me, the way viruses are. They are picked up. I mean, we're breathing viruses every day. They're floating in our bloodstream. They're in our lymphatics. They're in the gastrointestinal tract. In most cases, we don't even know it because nothing happens. Either because, number one, our immune system has antibodies built for that particular virus. So as soon as there's an entrance, immediately the signal goes up. They're neutralized. The phagocytes break them down, and they're out. We may not know it at all, or we may feel like something's just a little bit off for a day or so, and then that's the end of it, and so we never know it even happened. Some of them, because of the nature of the way it works, they stay there all the time. They can be circulating in your blood all the time and nothing happening. Very possible. But you can't go through a day without breathing in or getting in your food or water or handling your pet or whatever without picking up a few viral particles. Now, when I say a viral particle, what I'm meaning is that a segment of DNA or a segment or group of segments of RNA. Now, influenza virus is a strange one. And it's strange in the sense that the actual influenza has within its core 8 strands of RNA. It's like you would take a deck of cards and you'd shuffle them and you'd draw out 8 cards, and those numbers would represent the code of that DNA. RNA. And so there's 8 pieces. Now, the interesting thing, when they get into pigs, which influenza viruses do, and the pigs don't get sick with them, but because of the nature of the virus getting inside a cell and cracking apart, meaning there's a protein code on it, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that breaks apart and empties out those 8 strands of RNA. And out of that, either your body is going to provoke a response to it, or it's not going to do anything and you won't know it. Meaning it doesn't create enough problem for you that you're even aware of it. Okay, so those 8 strands are representative of the code of a particular virus. Now, a flu virus. Now, if you get 2 or 3 different types of flus, and they happen to all 3 get in the same cell and open up, you've got 3 sets of 8 strands. Now, when it all regroups again, that's kind of like shuffling the cards. Those 8 strands can come up different. Meaning the 3, if you took the 24 cards and you just shuffled them and separated them into 3 groups of 8. That's the code of the 3 types of influenza virus. Now, if you then shuffle them all together again and re-dealt out 3 8s, it would be a different code, a different set of numbers. And that's the way it is when a mixture of flu viruses get in a cell. And ducks are another place they get in, and we probably won't talk about it now, but we'll talk about how that can lead to a very effective accelerating treatment to get over a flu virus. Anyhow, in ducks the same thing can happen. Ducks do not get a problem from influenza viruses, but they do acquire them, and they tend to max and reshuffle, just like we talked about. So there's 2 sources where either ducks or pigs can redistribute the coding of different influenzas. Now, as I say, they act mechanically. When I say mechanically, when you put a group of RNA or DNA code together, I'm talking about code being the final grouping. If you're talking about RNA, you're talking about a group of nucleic acids. DNA. RNA, you're talking about also the same thing, but only half of it, because it's a single strand as a rule, although there can be double strand RNA. Again, that's beyond what we want to talk about. But the single strand RNA is what's inside something like Ebola. And pretty much all the flu viruses, and a lot of other viruses, other hemorrhagic fevers, they're all RNA viruses, and they have that single strand with nucleic acids forming a chain. Okay, now, when you get a group of those, they exert an attractive electromagnetic field, which is how atoms come together and molecules are by electromagnetic fields, and so they attract certain amino acids that come together and form a coating around those strands. Okay, so it's that coating that becomes the antigen code for that virus as a rule. Everything always has its exception, but as a general rule, that's true. Okay, so now that code determines what kind of cell is going to have a receptor site that cap of protein or amino acids is attracted to and can get taken into a cell. And that's the whole thing. The viral particle has to get inside the cell before anything bad happens. And when it gets in, the protein coat gets stripped off and exposes the RNA. And because there's machinery in a cell called a ribosome that will create protein based on amino acid combinations, it can pick up this piece of RNA as a code and start synthesizing more particles that can reassemble into more viruses. Now, when the body starts to build a protein, it has a start and stop signal. That means it only makes so much, then stops. But since there is no stop or start signal on this RNA, if it gets picked up by the ribosomes in the cell, it just keeps cranking it out until the cell becomes engorged full of all these particles. Now, that would happen if the cell is caught off guard. And so, if you have a viral particle, let's say hepatitis A, for example, it has a protein coat that is attracted to the receptor site on liver cells. And therefore, as it comes floating by, the code connects, like putting a key in the lock, and it's taken into the cell, stripped off, and it begins to affect the cell. And so then we would say, oh, now you have hepatitis A, because now the body would start to build, it's a long chain of things that start happening until it's over. So in the meantime, some cells die off. And when that happens, because two reasons, it just overloads the cell, but more often it's going to be cell death created by suicide. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the coding, the process, so you understand what it is. I'm trying to make it simple, but I want you to get an understanding that you're not attacked by the viruses. They don't have a digestive tract like bacteria who digest certain things as food. It doesn't do it. The virus doesn't do food. It doesn't have, in my mind, it doesn't have a consciousness. I could be wrong, but there's nothing about it that indicates to me that it's anything more than a chemical process, and it's not directed by anything. It's all random occurrence. Okay, so once it gets into a cell, it has to be picked up by a receptor site. So if it were one that mimics something that a liver cell might use, then the liver cell receptor site would take it inside and think it's going to make use of it. But once the protein coat strips off, now you've got a piece of bad code in the cell, and that leads to problems. Okay, so once that occurs, and once it's picked up by a ribosome, because the ribosome doesn't care, it picks up RNA and makes copies. So if you put the RNA of a viral particle in, which I call bad information in the cell, it starts replicating more and more of the RNA. Now, you know that having a huge amount of that inside the cell is going to cause havoc in the cell. So there's a series of things happen that happens to be our protective system kicks into gear once it happens. And it's important that you understand that, because bottom line, those people who recover from viruses of any kind do so because their body's immune system takes over and ultimately gains control and clears it out, along with all the cells that were casualties in the process. Okay, so here's this cell becoming filled up with these viral particles. So the cell has a series of things that it does. Number one, it immediately starts to synthesize some interferon, which is a messenger that it releases on the outside of the cell to the surrounding cells, saying there's a problem. It's like yelling at the neighbors, or Paul Revere making his ride, the British are coming. This interferon tells the surrounding cells there's trouble. So what do? They start locking up the gates. So that's first thing that happens. Second thing that happens, there's something called a major histocompatibility complex. And it's called with an M, major, MHC for short. It makes a copy of the code of that virus particle and puts it out on the cell surface like a little radio transmitter saying, beep, 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 we got trouble. And guess what? That message is picked up by the immune system. And it starts to come and pick up that code and start to build antibodies. Okay, so that's the second thing that happens. Now, when it becomes evident that the cell is done, it's not going to make it, it's overburdened, there's another intracellular structure called a lysosome that opens up and fills the interior of the cell with proteases and enzymes that destroy or self-destruct the contents of the cell, and including all the viral particles that are in the cell. So that's the end of that cell, and all of that material that had filled up the cell is all wiped out by the enzymes. Now the cell's dead, of course. So the cell then is released, and along come phagocytes, which are types of white cells that are like Pac-Man. They digest things that shouldn't be there, and they get digested by the phagocytes. Now, that's the immune process. But at the same time, because the major histocompatibility complex presented the code to the surface of the cell and the body's immune system started building antibodies, then any other particles that happen to be floating around in the blood are connected onto antibodies, which neutralizes them, and then phagocytes come along and digest them, and they're gone. So that's the body's immune system, and that's what always takes care of problems, is the body's immune system. Now, there are some interesting books, and one of the books that you might like to read was written several years ago by an MD. His name was, I'll think of it in a minute now. I was going to bring it in with me and I evidently didn't. But anyhow, this book is called The Body's the Hero. And in that book, it ends up that he says no matter what happens, even with things that are treated with antibiotics, it's not any of that that is the ultimate protector of the body, it's the immune system. And he also goes on to say that probably not more than once or twice in a person's life should one ever take an antibiotic, and he talks about the abuses of antibiotics and the problems that have been created by them. So it's a very good book to read. Glasser's his name, Richard Glasser, I'm sorry. And it's a very good book to get. It's still available. I checked with Amazon. I've had it for years, and a lot of good books were written along the way, but they never became real popular. But this gentleman is an immunologist, specialist, consultant to the World Health Organization at the time that he wrote the book. So he was not just your average run-of-the-mill. He was a very knowledgeable immunologist and consultant to the World Health, not just the U.S. And so very good book to read. So I would pick that one up and read it, and you'll find it very interesting. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea what's involved with the body and the immune system. Now, because I said it doesn't live, a viral particle does not live, in my mind it is inert. Everything is chemical and electromagnetic in nature that takes place with it. It doesn't have any intent to kill you. It doesn't try to hide. It doesn't do any of this. But it does change because, like all replications, there's something called drift and shift in viruses. Because so many of these viruses are replicating rapidly, errors occur. And when over time, that's called a drift. Over time, the code changes enough that it now attracts a different group of amino acids to form a code, and now it has a new antigen code, and therefore, whatever you were immune to before, it's not the same anymore. And then you can become susceptible to your body having to start from scratch again. Now, I don't know if that's making any sense to you, but that's the way that it really works. So you get a drift and a shift. That happened, and does happen occasionally, like in the 1940s and 1950s. Polio, people had become basically immune to polio, but all of a sudden there was a mutation occurred. There was a drift to the point that it shifted totally. The body's immune system has no antibodies that would match the new code of the protein code, so all of a sudden we had a minor epidemic of polio for a while. And that happens always with viruses. You have this antigen drift and shift that occurs, and therefore all bets are off. No matter what you were immune to before, your body has to now start over and build new antibodies for this new. Now you know, maybe you don't know, but when you first get something in the body, the first antibodies built are immunoglobulin M, which is capable of neutralizing more than one particle at one shot. That's for the acute phase. At the same time, after a few days of the acute phase, the body starts to manufacture something called immunoglobulin G, which is the permanent memory form of that code. And so those are the ones that remain. The immunoglobulin M and the deactivated whatever it is, antigen, is broken down by phagocytes and destroyed, and that's the end of it. But the immunoglobulin G stays in. So that's when you can get a blood test and say, can you tell me if I have had Coxsackie flu virus before? And they can run an antibody test for Coxsackie on your blood, and what they are checking is immunoglobulin G of Coxsackie's code. And they can determine, yes, at some point you've had it because you, or at least were exposed to it because you now have antibodies for it. And so they can do that with any virus. The only problem is there's hundreds of viruses, and so they don't do a blood test that tests you for all those viruses. The doctor has to have an idea what virus he's looking for, and then he can test it out. But without knowing or having some suspicion of what you might be looking for, you're not going to be able to find it because it would be too expensive to do that kind of blood test for 300 viruses. So the doctor, by his own knowledge of your symptoms or what has happened to you in time past or what your exposures were, would be then deciding, okay, run one for this. You know, if he suspected you had hepatitis before, he could run a hepatitis A, B, C, or even a panel of, now that's all the way down to G, I think, on the hepatitis. And that way you got some idea what you had. Now, if you have antibodies, then that means your body was exposed and has successfully built antibodies for it. Now, something can happen, and I've seen this happen, that you could be exposed to a virus and your body immune system was not up to par and you didn't build antibodies. So they would run a test and say, oh no, you didn't have Epstein-Barr because there's no immunoglobulin G antibodies present, and therefore you must never have had it. I've seen that happen. But that doesn't mean you didn't have an exposure. Probably if you ran a test for it being present, they may pick up actual viral particles of Epstein-Barr, for example. You know, so virology is very interesting. It's complex in some respects, and then once you get the feel for it, it's pretty simple. But it all gets down to, can it get into your cell? And that's the method of entrance. Now, I have a big research article I had pulled up called Cellular Entry of Ebola Virus Involves Uptake by a Macro Pinocytosis or Pinocytosis like Mechanism. Now, I don't know if you know what pinocytosis is, but it means the body can move things through tissue by invaginating, meaning forming a hole and taking something in, then covering it around and taking it through like a membrane to the other side. And your body a lot of times gets rid of things and puts it out to the surface of the body by pinocytosis. And it can take things into the cell by the same process. Well, these Ebola viral particles are giant compared to a lot of viruses. So it takes a very large pinocytosis, and that's why it's called macropinocytosis. That is what it appears is how it takes place. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the viruses and how it all works. And the bottom line is, because it's a virus and because it's not susceptible to antibiotics, because there's nothing to kill because it doesn't live. Now keep that in mind. That's why when you have a flu, it's ridiculous to take an antibiotic because it's a virus and a virus doesn't live, and hence you can't kill it. Antibiotics are aimed at interrupting a reproductive or replicating process within a bacterial form or disrupting the metabolic machinery inside the bacterial form, and hence it's a different process. Because it's a living organism, the antibody can have some effect, but on a virus there is no life in it that can be disrupted because it's not there. The only thing that can get rid of it is your immune system and your antibodies. Otherwise, and there's another part of the immune system, of course, I didn't bring it up yet. The reason you get a fever is that these particles are protein in nature, and proteins are susceptible to heat. And what does heat do? Heat breaks the bond between the molecules or atoms, and proteins, that's why your body fevers, or at least one of the reasons is when you raise the body temperature, it causes viral particles to start to fall apart. So watch it taking down a fever when you have a virus, because that's part of your body's immune process to get rid of the virus. So I have to throw that in. And hence, by saying that, I'm saying that it takes an immune enhancement, prevention, or treatment for any of these viruses to really be effective. Now, we had one in this country that popped up several years ago. It occurred out in the Four Corner area out west among the Indians. Now, I don't remember if you heard of it or not, or if you did, if you paid any attention. It was called the Hantavirus. Now, that was ultimately it was determined that it was a variant or a derivative of another hemorrhagic fever virus called Hantavirus out of the East. China and some of those areas have had that for a long time. Hantavirus, all the hemorrhagic fever viruses affect the blood vessels. That's why they're called a hemorrhagic fever virus. And of course, the virus is right there in the vessel, and if it's got the right code to get into the cells that form the vascular system, guess what? It makes holes in it and you start bleeding or leaking plasma. Now the Hatan didn't make it so disturbed that it leaked out the components of the blood, the red blood cells and all that. It only leaked out the plasma. So what happened is that these people, these Indians, in this mini epidemic, picked up this virus, which was named Hanta, a derivative of Hatan. And what it would do is the people would act like they're getting a flu, and in just a few days after getting this flu, they would think they're going to get better, and then suddenly they could hardly breathe and they would die. And they thought, wow, what's going on? Well, they found that it wasn't a regular flu, it was a hemorrhagic fever virus that was causing the blood vessels in the lungs to leak out blood plasma and fill the lung with blood plasma and drown the person. So there wasn't the red blood that you normally think of, like with Ebola and Crimean Congo fever and Hatan and some of the others. It just caused leakiness of the plasma. So at any rate, we had that. It came and went, and I thought it very suspicious at the time. I still do. And I think they had a few cases, very few, like 2 or 3 or something, in Boston area for some reason. But it was primarily with the Indians out in Four Corners, which are the junction of 4 states out there. I'm sure you know what that is. And then it suddenly disappeared, which is interesting because as you read the book, if you do, by Preston on the hot zone, you'll find that Ebola comes on, all of a sudden it seems to be very robust, and then seems to wither and disappear, and then it's quiet. Now, we didn't talk about the different kinds of it, but the one that seems to be the big problem, or has been worst of all of them, because there's some variants of it, the big one is the Zaire group seems to have had the most fatalities, and the one current, I think, is a derivative of the Zaire type. But we will get into that a little bit more, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some things that you might consider doing, at least to let you know. I personally feel that it's correctable with the right therapy, but it has to engage your body in the process, and I know of some ways that can be done. So at our next broadcast, we'll go just a little bit further into implications and some other interesting material that I've run into related to the Ebola. And hopefully it will answer a lot of your questions and maybe take away some of the fear. Not that I'm saying any of these, it's like a crapshoot. At any given time, under high stress, your immune system can be depressed, and you might be in big trouble. So we'll be talking about ways of enhancing your immune system and some other compatible, therapies that could work to your benefit. It was nice being with you again. Be sure and watch the next one, because I think you'll find some very interesting and helpful information. And I hope that we don't want you to think, well, we won't worry, nothing, that it is something, but there's very few things that there's not some answer to. And so I think you'll find the next broadcast intriguing. It was nice being with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and until the next time, be healthy.